The snowfall had finally stopped, leaving the ranger station eerily quiet as Sergeant Briggs stared at the empty kennel where Apollo should have been. 3 months had passed since his canine partner disappeared during that ill-fated mountain rescue, vanishing. With blood on his fur and his tracking signal gone silent, Briggs had searched until his superiors ordered him to stop, to accept what everyone else already had. No dog could survive those mountains alone, especially wounded. Yet there he stood. Now, this impossible ghost of fur and loyalty, thin but alive, dragging a mud-caked satchel in his jaws. Inside lay the silver locket, Briggs's last gift from his wife before she passed, lost years ago in those same unforgiving peaks. The weathered soldier's hands trembled as he clutched the treasure, meeting Apollo's knowing gaze. What incredible journey had this loyal companion endured to bring back not just himself, but the most precious memory Briggs had ever lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sergeant Michael Briggs ran his thumb over the worn edges of his ranger badge, the metal smooth from years of the same absent-minded gesture. At 55, his face weathered like the mountains he now called home, he had found a kind of peace in this remote outpost that eluded him elsewhere. The solitude suited him, or so he told himself. Apollo's sudden return upended everything. Briggs watched the Belgian Malinois sleeping now, ribs still visible beneath his tawny coat, despite the hearty meal Briggs had prepared. Even in sleep, the dog's muscles twitched as though running, fighting, or perhaps searching still. "You shouldn't have made it," Briggs whispered, his voice rough from disuse. The nearest ranger station was 40 miles away, and he spoke to few people besides Captain Hayes during their weekly check-ins. Eleanor Hayes had given him this job 5 years ago. After his discharge and Catherine's passing came too close together, leaving him adrift. "The mountains might do you good," she'd said, not entirely convinced but willing to take a chance on her old friend's husband. "Just don't become a hermit up there." He'd brought Apollo with him, the only remnant of his military life he couldn't bear to leave behind. They'd served 3 tours together, the dog's extraordinary tracking abilities saving countless lives. Now they tracked lost hikers instead of insurgents, a quieter life that suited them both. The radio crackled, startling Briggs from his thoughts. "Base to Timber Ridge. Come in." Hayes's voice, formal but tinged with concern. "Timber Ridge receiving?" Briggs replied, "Just checking if our miracle dog is still with you. Darren's coming up tomorrow with supplies and is bringing extra kibble." Darren Miller was the park technician, 30-something with an engineering degree and a respect for the wilderness that Briggs appreciated. Unlike the seasonal rangers, he never asked about Briggs's past or why he'd chosen isolation. "Roger that. And Hayes, tell him to bring Dr. Chen if she's available. Apollo's injuries need proper attention." Already arranged. She was as shocked as the rest of us. A pause. "It's good news, Mike. Let yourself have that." The radio went silent, leaving Briggs with memories he'd rather avoid. He pulled out the locket again, the silver tarnished but unmistakable. Catherine had pressed it into his palm before his final deployment. "Come back to me," she'd said, placing a photo of them inside. She never asked him not to go. She understood duty better than most, but that was the first time he'd seen fear in her eyes. He'd returned, but she hadn't been waiting. A rainy highway, a truck driver who'd fallen asleep at the wheel. The universe's cruel joke. The locket had been with him during that first grief-stricken climb in these very mountains. The broken clasp, the tumble down a rocky slope, the hours searching until darkness forced him back to base. Just another loss to bear. Yet here it was, carried back by the one companion who had never left his side. Apollo's eyes opened suddenly, alert but calm. He rose stiffly, favoring his right side, and padded to Briggs, resting his head on the man's knee. The gesture so familiar it made Briggs's chest ache. "What happened out there, boy?" Briggs asked, scratching behind Apollo's ears. Where have you been? The dog's intelligent eyes seemed to hold answers just beyond translation. Apollo moved to the door, looking back expectantly, then returned when Briggs didn't follow. Not tonight, Briggs said. Rest first, then we'll figure this out. Tomorrow would bring questions, examinations, probably arguments about whether Apollo should be retired after such an ordeal. But tonight, in the quiet cabin with snow falling again outside, Briggs allowed himself one moment of simple gratitude. Against all odds, Apollo had come home and brought with him the one treasure Briggs thought was lost forever. The mountains kept their secrets well. Tomorrow, perhaps, Apollo would help him uncover them. Dr. Sarah Chen's practiced hands moved methodically over Apollo's frame, her expression remaining neutral despite what she found. Only the occasional tightening around her eyes betrayed her concern. He's lost nearly 20% of his body weight, she said, making notes on her tablet. But that's not what worries me most. Briggs stood nearby, arms crossed, watching. Every movement. The remnants of Apollo's military vest lay on the examination table, once state-of-the-art K9 tactical gear, now tattered and stained with substances Dr. Chen had taken samples of. These lacerations along his flank, she continued, gently parting Apollo's fur to reveal healing wounds. Consistent with a large predator attack, mountain lion most likely. He fought off a mountain lion? Briggs's voice was incredulous. Fought off or escaped? Either way, he's lucky to be alive. She examined Apollo's paws next, finding them worn, but remarkably intact. He's traveled a considerable distance on difficult terrain. Apollo remained still throughout the examination, his eyes rarely leaving Briggs. Only when Dr. Chen touched certain areas did he flinch or growl softly. Tell me exactly what happened the day he disappeared, Dr. Chen said, administering a local anesthetic before cleaning a particularly deep wound. Briggs recounted the rescue. Mission: 2 hikers stranded on Blackridge Peak during an early snowstorm. Standard procedure until the weather worsened suddenly. Visibility dropped to near zero. Apollo had been tracking ahead when a section of trail gave way. By the time Briggs reached the spot, there was only disturbed snow and Apollo's tracking. Signal fading as it moved downslope before disappearing entirely. 3 days we searched, Briggs said, his voice hollow. Helicopter sweeps, thermal imaging, everything, nothing. Dr. Chen nodded, moving on to examine the mud-caked satchel Apollo had returned with. It was hand-woven, weathered but clearly human-made. This isn't standard equipment, she observed. No, I've never seen it before. Briggs handed her the locket. But this was inside. It's mine. Dr. Chen studied the silver pendant. Catherine's gift? Before my last deployment. Lost it 3 years ago climbing near Eagle Ridge, 30 miles from where Apollo disappeared. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. That's quite a journey, especially for an injured animal. She returned the locket, then used a magnifying glass to examine. Residue in the satchel's weave. There's something else here. Cave sediment, possibly. And these mineral traces? She scraped a small sample into a container. I'd need to test this properly, but it's unusual. Apollo whined softly, standing despite Dr. Chen's gentle pressure to keep him still. He moved to Briggs, then to the cabin door, looking back expectantly. He's been doing that since he returned, Briggs explained, like he wants to show me something. Dr. Chen finished bandaging Apollo's worst injuries, then packed her equipment. Physically, he'll recover with proper care and rest. She handed Briggs medication and detailed instructions. But there's something more happening here, Mike. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I'm a veterinarian, not a mystical person. But in 25 years of practice, I've never seen anything like this. Dogs have incredible abilities we're only beginning to understand, but finding a specific object from years ago, miles from where it was lost. Apollo returned to Briggs's, sighed, pressing against his leg, as if to emphasize Dr. Chen's point. Catherine always said he was special, Briggs said softly. More than just a working dog. Dr. Chen nodded. closing her medical bag. Whatever happened out there, he came back for a reason, and I don't think his journey is finished yet. As she left, snow began falling again, soft flakes already covering her tire tracks. Apollo stood at the window, watching the mountains with an intensity that left Briggs unsettled, and for the first time in years, curious about what lay beyond the silent peaks. Back in his cabin, Briggs spread the topographical map across his desk, the paper worn at the creases from countless unfoldings. Each colored line represented a different search route from 3 months ago. Red for the first day, when hope was still high, blue for the second, when desperation set in, black for the final day, when Captain Hayes had physically pulled him back. To base. "Enough, Mike," she'd said, her voice firm but compassionate. "You'll die out there, and it won't bring him back." Apollo lay nearby on his bed, watching Briggs with attentive eyes. The locket sat on the corner of the map, catching the lamplight. Briggs picked it up again, turning it over in his palm. The silver was tarnished but unmistakable, the small dent on the back where he'd dropped it during basic training, the inscription inside, "Return to me, always. K." He'd examined it a dozen times since Apollo's return, as if expecting it to transform into a replica, a cruel joke. But it was real. Catherine's last gift, somehow returned from the wilderness by the only other being he'd allowed himself to love after her death. The radio crackled to life. "Timber Ridge, this is Base. Come in." Briggs reached for the handset. "Go ahead, Base. Weather Service is predicting the first major system of the season," Hayes said without preamble. 5 days out, possibly 6. After that, those passes will be impassable until spring. "Understood. Don't do it, Mike." Hayes's tone shifted, the formality dropping away. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. Apollo made it back. That's the miracle. Don't push for another one." Briggs studied the map silently, tracing the ridgeline where he'd lost the locket years ago, 30 miles from where Apollo disappeared. "Impossible." "Mike, acknowledge." "I hear you," he finally responded. "But there's something out there, Eleanor, something important. More important than your life, because that's what you'd be risking." A pause. "Retirement papers are ready whenever you want them. 28 years of service, Mike. You've earned your rest." Rest. The word hung in the air after Hayes signed off. He'd been resting or hiding for 5 years now. The ranger station was just another form of isolation, a place where memories couldn't find him. Or so he'd thought. Apollo stood suddenly, ears alert, and moved to Briggs's side. He placed his paw precisely on the map, over a section of wilderness Briggs hadn't searched. The gesture was so deliberate it sent a chill down his spine. "You trying to tell me something, boy?" Apollo's intelligent eyes held his gaze, then returned to the map. In the lamplight, Briggs noticed something he'd missed. Traces of the same unusual mineral Dr. Chen had found in the satchel, glittering faintly in Apollo's fur. Briggs took a magnifying glass from his desk drawer and examined the map more carefully. The area Apollo indicated contained a network of old mining claims, most abandoned since the early 1900s, caves possibly, places where a wounded animal might shelter, places where lost things might remain hidden for years. His gaze shifted to the framed photo of Catherine on his desk. She'd never been one to leave mysteries unsolved or journeys unfinished. "What would you do, Kate?" he whispered. The answer came not in words, but in the memory of her laugh, bright and fearless, the day they'd climbed their first peak together. "The only way to know what's at the top," she'd told him, "is to climb it." Briggs folded the map along new lines and reached for his expedition notebook. 5 days until the storm, perhaps enough time to find answers if he moved quickly. Apollo watched him prepare, tail wagging slightly for the first time since his return. "All right," Briggs said quietly. "Show me." Dawn cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Briggs methodically packed his expedition gear. Each item went through a mental checklist: necessity, weight, redundancy. 30 years of wilderness. Experience had taught him that the difference between life and death often came down to ounces and inches. Apollo sat watching, unusually still, except for his eyes, which followed Briggs's every movement. When Briggs retrieved his father's old brass compass from its wooden case, Apollo's ears perked forward. "Dad always said a compass tells the truth even when your mind gets lost," Briggs told him, polishing the tarnished metal with his thumb. "Electronic gear fails, batteries die, but this just works." The compass had guided his father through Korea, then Briggs through Afghanistan. Simple technology that had outlasted empires. A knock at the door announced Darren's arrival, his arms loaded with additional supplies. "Captain Hayes said you'd need these," he said, setting down the packages. "She also said to tell you you're a stubborn old fool." He paused. "Her words, not mine." Briggs allowed a small smile. "She's not wrong." Darren helped organize the supplies, his movements efficient despite his obvious concern. "The weather models don't agree on timing. The storm could hit earlier than expected." "All the more reason to move quickly," Briggs replied. Darren glanced at the maps and notes spread across the table. "This is about more than just finding out where he's been, isn't it?" Briggs didn't answer immediately. He checked Apollo's special pack, lightweight but insulated, with compartments for emergency supplies and first aid. Dr. Chen had cleared Apollo for light duty, emphasizing he shouldn't carry much weight given his injuries. "Apollo found something out there," Briggs finally said. "Something important." "The locket." Darren nodded. "Not just that. The way he's acting, he wants me to follow him." Darren looked skeptical but didn't argue. Instead, he helped Briggs run through communication protocols, synchronizing their satellite phones and establishing check-in schedules. "Every 6 hours, Darren insisted. "Miss 2 check-ins and Hayes will have the helicopter up, weather permitting." Briggs agreed, though they both knew helicopter rescue would be impossible once the storm arrived. While finalizing the preparations, Briggs took Apollo outside to assess his recovery and readiness. The dog moved with growing confidence, only favoring his injured side slightly. When Briggs ran him through basic tracking exercises, Apollo performed flawlessly, his training undiminished by his ordeal. "He's remarkable," Darren observed. "Most animals wouldn't have survived what he's been through." "He's always been special," Briggs said, remembering Catherine's insistence that Apollo understood more than most humans gave him credit for. She'd sit for hours talking to the dog as if he comprehended every word. And sometimes, Briggs had to admit, it seemed like he did. The memory triggered another, Catherine tucking her journal into Briggs's pack before a training exercise. "So you'll have my words, even when I'm not there," she'd said. The small, leather-bound book had accompanied him on every journey since her death, its pages filled with her observations and sketches. Briggs retrieved it now, carefully wrapping it in waterproof material before placing it in his chest pocket. Apollo watched the familiar ritual with apparent understanding. As evening approached, Briggs made final adjustments to their gear, calculating distances and potential campsites. Their window was narrow, 3 days out, 2 days back, if the weather held, just enough time to reach the area Apollo had indicated and return before the storm hit. "We leave at first light," Briggs told Apollo, who had positioned himself by the door as if worried Briggs might depart without him. That night, for the first time since Apollo's return, Briggs slept deeply, without the nightmares that had plagued him for years. In the morning he would follow Apollo into the mountains, toward whatever truth awaited them there. First light brought a sky streaked with crimson, the kind old-timers called a blood dawn. Briggs stood on the cabin porch, reading the mountains, as others might read a newspaper. The air carried the metallic scent of coming snow, though the forecasted storm remained days away. These peaks made their own weather, unpredictable and fierce. "Sure you won't reconsider?" Captain Hayes had appeared at the tree line, her jeep parked on the service road beyond. She looked tired, as though she'd driven through the night to make. On final appeal, "Eleanor," Briggs acknowledged with a nod, "didn't expect to see you in person." Some conversation shouldn't happen over radio. She approached, surveying his packed gear with a professional eye. You're really doing this? It wasn't a question. Apollo emerged from the cabin, wearing his lightweight pack and moving with purpose. He didn't stop for Hayes's customary pat, instead positioning himself at the trailhead, looking back at Briggs with unmistakable impatience. Looks like your partner's made the decision for you, Hayes observed dryly. Briggs shouldered his pack, the familiar weight settling against his spine. Catherine's journal pressed against his chest, a small warmth through layers of fabric. 3 days out, 2 back, he said. If we're not in radio contact by sunset on the 5th day... I know the drill, Hayes interrupted. I've arranged for the rescue team to be on standby, though they won't be happy about risking their necks because you've gone on some wild goose chase. And it's not a chase if you know what you're looking for. Hayes studied him, her weathered face softening slightly. And do you, Mike, know what you're looking for? Briggs glanced at Apollo, then back to the mountains rising before them. Peaks, already touched with early snow. I'll know when I find it. Hayes sighed, then unexpectedly stepped forward and hugged him, a brief, awkward gesture that surprised them both. Catherine would kick my ass if I let anything happen to you, she said, stepping back. So don't make me explain to her ghost why I let you wander off to freeze to death. The mention of Catherine didn't sting, as it usually did. Perhaps because, for the first time in years, Briggs felt he was moving toward something rather than away. I'll be careful, he promised, checking his watch. First check-in at 1400 hours. Hayes nodded and returned to her vehicle. As she pulled away, Briggs noticed she'd left something on the porch railing. A small bottle of her prized scotch, with a note for when you get back. When, not if. The distinction mattered. Briggs pocketed the note and turned to Apollo. Ready, boy? The dog was already moving, his stride purposeful despite his recent injuries. He followed a path different from any they'd taken during the search 3 months ago, heading northwest toward a less traveled section of the range. The first hour passed in silence, broken only by the rhythm of Briggs's boots and Apollo's lighter tread. The trail climbed steadily, winding through stands of lodgepole pine, frosted with the previous night's snowfall. Apollo moved with certainty, occasionally looking back to ensure Briggs followed, but never deviating from his chosen route. By mid-morning, they'd reached a ridge overlooking the valley, where the ranger station now appeared as a tiny speck. Briggs paused, taking readings with his compass and marking their position on the map. Apollo waited with unusual patience, his attention fixed on the mountains ahead. The first radio check went smoothly, Hayes's voice clear despite the distance. Weather update, she reported. Storm fronts moving faster than predicted. You may have 4 days, not 5. Understood, Briggs replied, studying the horizon. No signs of trouble yet, but he knew how quickly that could change. As they prepared to continue, Apollo suddenly froze, ears forward, body alert. Briggs instinctively reached for his sidearm, scanning their surroundings. But Apollo wasn't signaling. Danger. He was listening, head tilted as if catching a sound beyond human perception. Then just as suddenly he relaxed and resumed the trail, his determination visibly renewed. Whatever called to Apollo from the mountains, Briggs thought, it was growing stronger as they drew closer. Morning frost crunched beneath Briggs's boots as they set out on their second day. The temperature had dropped overnight, leaving their tent stiff with ice. Apollo seemed unaffected, his breath clouding in the crisp air as he led them deeper into the wilderness. By midday, the terrain grew familiar in a way that tightened Briggs's chest. They were approaching the area where Apollo had disappeared during that chaotic rescue mission 3 months ago. "Hold up, boy," Briggs called, consulting his map. Apollo paused, watching as Briggs oriented himself. They stood on a narrow ridge, overlooking a steep ravine. Below, jagged rocks jutted from patches of early snow. Briggs remembered the disorienting whiteout conditions, the panic when he realized Apollo's tracking signal was moving rapidly downslope. "This is where it happened," he murmured. Apollo moved to the edge, looking down with unmistakable recognition. He turned to Briggs and gave a soft whine, then began picking his way carefully down a game trail Briggs hadn't noticed during the search. Briggs followed, using his trekking poles for balance on the treacherous descent. Halfway down, Apollo stopped abruptly at a small ledge and began pawing at the ground. Briggs knelt beside him, brushing away loose stones and dirt. What he found made his breath catch. Apollo's tracking collar, its signal light long dead. The strap torn and stained dark with old blood. "You took quite a fall, didn't you?" Briggs said softly, examining the collar. The emergency release had functioned as designed, preventing strangulation when caught on something. But the electronic components were crushed, explaining why the signal had died so suddenly. Apollo nudged Briggs's hand, urging him to continue downward. The trail grew steeper, requiring careful navigation around loose scree and ice-slick rocks. Near the bottom, Apollo led him to a protected alcove beneath an overhang. The ground told a story Briggs could read all too clearly. Disturbed earth, more dried blood, and tufts of Apollo's fur snagged on the rocks. "You sheltered here," Briggs realized, noting how the space was protected from wind and snow. Smart boy, but Apollo wasn't interested in praise. He moved to another spot several yards away, where the signs of a violent struggle were unmistakable. Deep gouges in the earth, larger tufts of Apollo's fur, and most tellingly, the distinctive tracks of a mountain lion, partially preserved in a patch of hardened mud. Briggs crouched to examine the prints. "Full-grown male, judging by the size," he muttered. The predator had apparently tracked the injured dog, seeing easy prey, but Apollo had fought back with enough ferocity to escape, though not unscathed. As they continued following Apollo's trail, from 3 months ago, Briggs was struck by how the dog had moved away from, rather than toward, the ranger station. Any normal animal would have tried to return to safety, to home. But Apollo had deliberately traveled in another direction, as if drawn by something more compelling than security. By late afternoon, they reached a small valley Briggs had never explored, well outside the search grid from 3 months ago. Here, Apollo's demeanor changed. He grew more alert, his movements deliberate as he led Briggs along a crystal-clear stream fed by mountain springs. The radio crackled, breaking the silence. "Base to Briggs, check-in time." Briggs reported their position and findings, carefully omitting his growing sense that something inexplicable was happening. Hayes wouldn't understand. Hell, he barely understood it himself. "Storm update," Hayes replied. "Front's accelerated again. You have 3 days maximum before it hits, less at higher elevations." "Copy that. We'll turn back tomorrow if necessary." Even as he said it, Briggs knew he was lying. Apollo had traveled miles through hostile wilderness, grievously injured, not towards safety, but towards something that had called to him strongly enough to overcome all instinct. Now, watching the dog scan the valley with intense focus, Briggs felt the same pull. Apollo suddenly stiffened, ears forward, nose testing the wind. Without warning, he bolted toward a jumble of massive boulders at the valley's edge, barking with an urgency Briggs hadn't heard since their military days, the signal for a critical discovery. "Apollo, wait!" Briggs called, shouldering his pack to follow. But the dog was already disappearing among the rocks, following a path only he could. "See?" Briggs scrambled over the jumbled boulders, Apollo's excited barks echoing between the rocks. The dog had disappeared into what appeared to be a solid rock face, but as Briggs drew closer, he saw it, a narrow fissure barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. "Apollo," he called, shining his flashlight into the darkness. Answering whines guided him forward. The passage widened after a few yards, opening into a space tall enough for Briggs to stand upright. His light revealed a cave entrance partially concealed by a rockfall that had occurred long ago, judging by the weathered edges. Without Apollo's guidance, he would have walked past it 100 times without noticing. Briggs paused at the threshold, sweeping his light around the opening. Just inside, he spotted something that made him kneel for a closer look. A flint arrowhead, its craftsmanship unmistakably Native American, perhaps centuries old. "People have been finding this place for a long time," he murmured, carefully placing the artifact in his pocket. Apollo whined impatiently from deeper inside. The cave opened further as Briggs moved forward, his light revealing a space much larger than he'd expected. The air was surprisingly warm compared to the mountain chill outside, and dry. Perfect shelter for a wounded animal. Signs of Apollo's extended stay were evident immediately. A depression in the sandy floor where he'd made his bed, paw prints preserved in the dust, even tufts of fur caught on rock projections. But there was something else that made Briggs's skin prickle. Evidence of human presence, old but unmistakable. Rusted mining tools leaned against one wall. A collapsed wooden crate held the remnants of supplies, tin cans corroded beyond recognition, glass bottles turned purple with age. This had been a prospector's hideaway once, perhaps during the silver boom that had swept these mountains in the 1890s. "You weren't alone here," Briggs said softly to Apollo, who was moving deeper into the cave with purpose. The dog clearly knew his way around the twisting passages, navigating with confidence born of familiarity. The main chamber branched into several tunnels. Apollo chose one without hesitation, looking back repeatedly to ensure Briggs followed. The passage narrowed again, forcing Briggs to duck his head as they proceeded. The walls here showed signs of deliberate excavation, pick marks and drill holes indicating serious mining efforts. The tunnel abruptly opened into a second chamber, smaller but remarkable for what it contained. Here, Apollo had created what Briggs could only describe as a collection. In one corner, carefully arranged, were objects the dog had apparently gathered during his time in the cave. A rusted pocket watch, several coins green with age, a metal button from what might have been a cavalry uniform, and a small tin box that had once held tobacco. "What were you doing, boy?" Briggs wondered aloud, examining the items without touching them. "Treasure hunting?" Apollo paced excitedly around the chamber, then settled beside a specific spot where the cave floor dipped slightly. He pawed at it, looking up at Briggs expectantly. Kneeling, Briggs directed his light where Apollo indicated. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just cave dust and small rocks. Then a glint caught his eye, something metallic embedded in the wall near the floor. Using his knife, he carefully scraped away decades of mineral deposits. A small metal box emerged, its surface etched with crude initials, JTM. With gentle pressure, Briggs worked it free from where it had been deliberately wedged into a crevice. Whatever was inside rattled faintly. Apollo watched with intense focus as Briggs examined his discovery. The box was sealed tight, its lid fused with age and minerals. Opening it would require tools and patience. As Briggs secured the box in his pack, a distant rumble echoed through the cave, thunder much closer than it should be. The storm was advancing faster than predicted. "We should head back to the entrance," Briggs told Apollo, suddenly aware of how far they'd ventured into the mountain. Set up camp there for the night. But Apollo had other ideas. Instead of returning the way they'd come, he trotted toward another passage. One Briggs hadn't noticed initially. The dog paused at its entrance, his posture communicating clearly. There was more to see, deeper in the mountain's heart. Outside, the gathering storm pressed against the peaks. Inside, mysteries waited in the darkness. Briggs checked his watch, calculated remaining daylight and made his decision. "Lead on," he told Apollo, adjusting his headlamp, "but not too far." The new passage descended gradually, its walls glistening with mineral deposits that caught and scattered Briggs's light in prismatic bursts. Apollo moved confidently ahead, occasionally looking back as if to ensure Briggs appreciated what he was being shown. "This goes deeper than any prospector's claim," Briggs muttered, noting how the rough-hewn mining tunnel had given way to a natural formation, a limestone cavity carved by ancient waters. The air grew noticeably warmer, humid with the breath of the mountain. The tunnel widened into a chamber that pulled an involuntary gasp from Briggs. His light revealed a cavern adorned with stalactites and stalagmites, some meeting to form columns that seemed to support the very mountain above them. The formations glistened with moisture, alive and growing in the darkness for millennia. "My God," Briggs whispered, his voice echoing softly. Apollo sat patiently, allowing him a moment to absorb the wonder of the place. As he swept his light across the chamber, Briggs spotted something incongruous among the natural beauty, a weathered miner's lantern perched on a flat rock. It was old, its metal body green with verdigris, but remarkably intact. Curious, Briggs approached and carefully lifted it. To his surprise, it still contained oil, the wick dry but preserved. "Someone meant to come back," he said to Apollo, who watched with knowing eyes. Using his own lighter, Briggs tested the ancient lamp. After a moment's hesitation, the wick caught, casting a warm, steady glow throughout the chamber. The shadows danced differently now, revealing details his flashlight had missed. Against one wall, partially concealed by a natural stone shelf, lay the remains of a man. The skeleton rested in a position of repose, not collapse. Arms crossed over the chest, legs straight, head cushioned on what might once have been a pack or coat. Not a tragic death, then, but a chosen ending. An old prospector who, perhaps injured or ill, had decided to make his final bed in this cathedral of stone. Briggs approached respectfully, careful not to disturb the sight. Beside the remains lay an old leather journal, its pages fused with age and moisture. He gently lifted it, knowing it was too fragile to open here. "You found him too, didn't you?" Briggs asked Apollo, who had moved to a specific spot near the skeleton. The dog pawed at the ground, then looked up expectantly. Briggs directed his light where Apollo indicated. There, in a small natural basin formed by the cave floor, lay a collection of small objects, similar to Apollo's treasure trove, in the upper chamber, but more deliberately arranged. Coins, buttons, a pocket knife, a gold tooth, and other personal effects were gathered in what Briggs suddenly recognized as a kind of memorial. He gathered his valuables before the end, Briggs realized. "And you added to his collection." Apollo's gaze was steady, almost solemn. He nudged Briggs's hand toward a specific spot in the arrangement. Briggs looked closer and felt his heart stutter. There, nestled among the long-dead miner's possessions, was a small depression where something had recently been removed, something approximately the size and shape of Catherine's locket. "That's where you found it," Briggs breathed. "But how did it get here?" Apollo moved to another part of the chamber, where the ceiling rose in a natural chimney. Looking up, Briggs could see a faint glimmer of light far above, a thin fissure connecting to the surface. He calculated mentally, matching the cave's orientation to his topographical maps. "Eagle Ridge," he whispered. "We're directly beneath it. When I fell and lost the locket, it must have dropped through that crack all the way down here." The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. The odds against Apollo finding this place, recognizing the locket's significance, and retrieving it were astronomical. Yet here they stood, surrounded by evidence of exactly that impossible journey. As if responding to Briggs's thoughts, Apollo moved to the far side of the chamber, where another passage beckoned. The dog's body language had changed, more urgent. Now his message clear. There was more to see, more to understand. Outside, the storm continued to gather strength. Inside, the old miner's lantern flickered steadily, illuminating paths both ancient and new. Briggs checked his watch, calculating remaining oxygen and battery life. They should turn back soon, but Apollo's eyes held a compelling urgency that Briggs couldn't ignore. "A little further," he conceded, patting Catherine's journal in his breast pocket. "Then we head back." Apollo trotted into the new passage without hesitation, disappearing around a bend. Briggs followed, the lantern casting his shadow long and distorted against the limestone walls. The deeper passage narrowed suddenly, forcing Briggs to crouch. Apollo had vanished ahead, but his occasional whines provided guidance through the darkness. The air grew cooler, suggesting another opening to the outside world. "Apollo, wait!" Briggs called, his voice bouncing oddly off the limestone walls. The passage took a sharp turn, then opened unexpectedly into a small chamber where Apollo sat waiting, his attention fixed on the ceiling. Briggs followed the dog's gaze upward and saw what had captured his interest: a perfect circle of daylight, no wider than a dinner plate, illuminating a patch of cave floor. As he watched, snowflakes began to spiral down through the opening, dancing in the shaft of light before dissolving on the stone below. The emergency radio at Briggs's belt suddenly crackled to life, startling them both. "Repeat, Briggs. Do. You copy? Emergency weather alert?" Captain Hayes's voice fought through static, fragments of her message breaking through. Briggs quickly adjusted the radio. "This is Briggs, receiving poorly. Say again. Over." Storm front collapsed. Barometric pressure dropped. More static. "Immediate shelter. Not survivable in open." The signal strengthened momentarily. "Mike, if you can hear me, the storm's hitting now. Not tomorrow, now. Wind speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour at elevation. Temperature dropping to -20 with wind chill. Do not attempt to return. Find shelter and stay put. Rescue operations suspended until..." The transmission died completely, leaving only the soft hiss of static. Briggs checked his satellite phone. No signal. The mountain's mass blocked transmission except near the natural chimney they'd passed earlier. He glanced at the ceiling opening again, watching as the snowfall intensified, the flakes now driving sideways with increasing force. "Guess we're staying put," he told Apollo, who seemed remarkably unconcerned. The dog circled the chamber once, then settled on a patch of sand, looking expectantly at Briggs. Taking stock of their situation, Briggs had to admit they were better off than they might have been. The cave provided perfect shelter from the storm. His pack contained enough provisions for several days. Water was available from the condensation on the cave walls, and the old miner's lantern would conserve his battery-powered lights. "Smart. Move, bringing me here before the storm hit," Briggs said to Apollo. Whether by instinct or something more inexplicable, the dog had guided them to safety just in time. Briggs set up a minimal camp, spreading his thermal blanket on the sandy floor, and arranging essential supplies within reach. The cave would maintain a constant temperature regardless of the conditions outside. Cool, but not dangerously cold. They could wait out the storm in relative comfort. With their immediate needs addressed, Briggs turned his attention to the metal box they'd discovered. Using his multi-tool, he carefully worked at the corroded lid, applying gentle pressure to break the mineral seal without damaging the contents. The lid finally gave way, with a soft crack. Inside, nestled in what had once been a velvet lining, now reduced to dust, lay a gold pocket watch and a daguerreotype photograph in a tarnished frame. The watch had stopped at 3:17, its hands frozen in time for perhaps a century. The photograph showed a stern-faced man in prospector's garb, standing beside a woman whose features, though faded, conveyed a quiet dignity. "JTM," Briggs murmured, recalling the initials on the box. He turned the watch over and found the same. Letters engraved on the back, along with a date, 1873. As he examined these relics of a life long past, the storm's fury increased overhead. Wind howled through the ceiling opening, creating an eerie, whistling moan that resonated throughout the chamber. Snow began to accumulate around the opening, occasionally falling in small clumps to the floor below. Apollo grew restless, pacing the chamber's perimeter before returning to Briggs's side. He nudged Briggs's pack, where Catherine's journal was stored. "You want me to read?" Briggs asked, surprised. He often read aloud from the journal during their nights in the wilderness, finding comfort in Catherine's words, but Apollo had never shown particular interest before. The dog settled beside him, head on paws but eyes alert. Outside, the storm raged on, transforming the mountain into a deadly landscape of wind and ice. But here, in this pocket beneath the earth, time seemed to follow different rules. Briggs retrieved the journal and opened to a random page, Catherine's familiar handwriting catching the lantern light. "Dreams are messages," he read, "not from beyond, but from deeper within. The voice we attribute to the dead is often our own wisdom, finally given permission to speak." He paused, struck by the relevance of her words to their current situation. Apollo watched him steadily, as if waiting for him to understand something important. Above them, the circle of daylight had vanished completely, blocked by accumulated snow. They were truly sealed in now, alone with the mountain's ancient silence and whatever messages it might contain. Hours passed in the strange timelessness of the cave. Briggs rationed the lantern oil, allowing himself brief periods of light interspersed with darkness. During one such dark interval, he retrieved a small waterproof photo album from his pack, another constant companion on his journeys since Catherine's death. When he relit the lantern, Apollo moved closer, settling against Briggs's side as he opened the album. The first photo showed Catherine on their wedding day, laughing as she tried to keep her veil from blowing away in a sudden gust of wind. Her joy radiated from the image, as palpable now as it had been 15 years ago. She hated staged photos, Briggs told Apollo, his voice soft in the cave's hush. Said they never captured what was real. Apollo's eyes moved from the photo to Briggs's face, attentive in a way that had always made Catherine insist the dog understood far more than most humans credited. The next pages chronicled their life together. Hiking the Appalachian Trail, Catherine's graduation from veterinary school, the small house they'd purchased with plans to fill it with children. Plans interrupted by deployments, then derailed permanently by the cancer diagnosis that came, cruelly, just 2 weeks after Briggs returned from his final tour. She never complained, Briggs said, turning to the last photos taken before her illness became visible. Not once. Said she'd rather spend whatever time she had living instead of dying. The final image showed Catherine with Apollo, taken just days before she passed. She sat in their backyard garden, Apollo's head in her lap, her fingers buried in his fur. Though gaunt, her eyes remained vibrant, filled with the same life force that had drawn Briggs to her from their first meeting. "She made me promise to keep living too," Briggs admitted, closing the album. "I haven't kept that promise very well." Apollo shifted, resting his muzzle on Briggs's knee in a gesture of comfort he'd often offered during those dark days after. Catherine's death, the simple connection, anchored Briggs, as it always had. "Is that why you brought me here, boy? To remind me?" The dog's gaze held steady, impossibly wise. In the lantern's glow, Briggs noticed something he'd missed earlier, a deep recess in the chamber wall, partially hidden by a rock formation. Curious, he rose and approached, holding the light higher. The alcove contained what appeared to be ancient pictographs, red ochre handprints and stylized animal figures that might have been drawn 1,000 years ago. Among them, unmistakably, was the figure of a wolf or large dog, depicted following a human figure up what looked like a mountain path. "This place has been special for a very long time," Briggs murmured, tracing the images with his eyes but not his fingers, respecting their antiquity. Apollo joined him, examining the pictographs with apparent interest before moving deeper into the alcove. Following with the lantern, Briggs discovered a small, perfectly preserved dream catcher hanging from a natural hook in the stone. Not ancient, but certainly not recent. Its sinew webbing darkened with age, feathers still attached, but fragile. "Someone else found comfort here," he said, carefully touching the edge of the wooden hoop. "Someone else needed guidance." As if in response, the dream catcher stirred slightly in a draught that shouldn't have existed in the sealed chamber. Briggs followed the movement of air to another narrow opening in the rock wall, barely visible in the shadowed alcove. Apollo was already squeezing through, clearly familiar with this hidden route. Briggs hesitated only briefly before following, the lantern held before him as he navigated the tight passage. It opened abruptly into a space so unexpected it momentarily stole his breath. A large, cathedral-like chamber stretched before him, its walls studded with crystal formations that caught and multiplied the lantern light into thousands of glittering points. The effect was like standing in a field of stars, beauty so overwhelming it seemed almost sacred. In the center of the chamber stood a natural column where water had dripped for millennia, building a formation that resembled an altar. Atop it rested a single perfect crystal, larger than Briggs's fist, glowing with an inner luminescence that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Apollo sat before this natural wonder, his posture almost reverential. When Briggs joined him, the dog leaned against his leg, a warm presence in the cool, timeless space. "What is this place?" Briggs whispered. Though he knew Apollo couldn't answer in words, yet something answered, not in language but in feeling. Here, in this chamber that few human eyes had ever seen, Briggs felt Catherine's presence more strongly than he had since her death. Not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the echo of her spirit, her curiosity, her deep appreciation, her beauty, her ability to find wonder in the world's secret places. For the first time in 5 years, the memory of her brought no pain, only a profound gratitude that they had shared the time they did. Exhaustion eventually overcame wonder, and Briggs made his bed near the crystal formation, the lantern extinguished to conserve oil. Apollo settled against him, a familiar warmth in the cool darkness. The storm continued to rage outside, its fury reduced to a distant moaning in the depths of the mountain. Sleep came swiftly, deeper than any Briggs had known in years, and with it, dreams of startling clarity. Catherine stood before him on a mountain. Trail he recognized, the first peak they'd climbed together in the Rockies. She wore her favorite red hiking jacket, her dark hair caught in a hasty ponytail, her face flushed with exertion and joy. "You're finally here," she said, her voice exactly as he remembered, a gentle alto with a hint of the Virginia hills where she'd grown up. "I've missed you," Briggs replied, the words coming without thought. She smiled, that particular smile that always made him feel as though he'd been given a precious gift. "I've been waiting. You've been stuck for so long, Mike." "I don't know how to get unstuck," he admitted. Catherine turned, gesturing toward the summit ahead. "The same way you climb a mountain, one step at a time, with your eyes on something higher than yourself." The dreamscape shifted. They were in their garden, the roses Catherine had planted in full bloom. Apollo lay at her feet, younger and unscarred. "He's been trying to help you," Catherine said, running her fingers through Apollo's fur. "He remembers what you've forgotten." "What have I forgotten?" Briggs asked. "That life is for the living." Catherine's eyes met his, serious now. "You've been half alive, Mike, existing, not living. It hurts too much to live without you. I'm not asking you to live without me." She touched his face, her hand warm against his cheek. "I'm asking you to live with what we had, not just what you lost." The dream shifted again. They stood in an unfamiliar place, a clearing surrounded by aspen trees, their leaves golden in autumn light. A simple cabin sat nestled against the tree line, smoke curling from its chimney. "What is this place?" Briggs asked. "Possibility," Catherine answered. "One of many." Apollo appeared at the cabin door, accompanied by another dog, younger, with the same intelligent eyes. Behind them, indistinct figures moved within the cabin's warmth. "I don't understand," Briggs said. "You will." Catherine's form began to fade, becoming translucent in the dreamlight. "Follow him, Mike. He knows the way." Briggs reached for her, but his hand passed through her fading image. "Catherine, wait! I'm not leaving!" Her voice came, though she had almost disappeared. "I'm showing you how to move forward. Look for me in the lives you touch, in the work you do. That's where I'll be." Briggs woke with a start, heart pounding. Apollo was sitting up beside him, alert and watchful, his eyes reflecting pinpoints of light, though the lantern remained unlit. For a disorienting moment, Briggs thought he saw a faint luminescence outlining the dog's form, but it vanished when he blinked. "Apollo," he whispered. The dog stood, stretching, then moved to Briggs's pack, nosing at the pocket where he kept Catherine's journal. The gesture was so deliberate it sent a chill down Briggs's spine. With trembling hands, he retrieved the journal and lit the lantern. Apollo settled beside him again as he opened to a random page, his eyes drawn immediately to an entry he'd read countless times before, but never fully understood. "Dreams speak truths we're not ready to hear in waking life." The indigenous peoples who first walked these mountains believed animals could guide humans between worlds, not just physical realms, but states of being. Grief is its own world, with its own geography. Sometimes we need guides to find our way back. Apollo watched him steadily as he read, as if gauging his comprehension. Outside, the howling of the storm had diminished slightly, suggesting the worst might have passed. Briggs closed the journal, his mind racing with half-formed realizations. He'd attributed Apollo's remarkable journey to canine loyalty and intelligence, extraordinary but explicable. Now he found himself considering something beyond rational explanation. "Did she send you?" he asked softly, feeling foolish even as the words left his mouth. Apollo's response was to rise and move toward the passage, leading back to the main cavern, pausing to ensure Briggs would follow. Something had changed in the dog's demeanor, a new purpose, an urgency that hadn't been there before. Gathering his essential gear, Briggs followed, the lantern casting jumping shadows on the crystal-studded walls. The dream lingered in his mind, not fading as dreams usually did, but remaining vivid and immediate. "One step at a time," he murmured, echoing Dream Catherine's words as they navigated the narrow passage, with eyes on something higher. Ahead, Apollo moved with confidence through the darkness, leading him towards something Briggs couldn't yet see, but was finally ready to discover. The main cavern appeared transformed in the lantern light, shadows dancing across the ancient walls. The storm's voice had changed to a more rhythmic moaning, suggesting diminished but still dangerous winds outside. Apollo paused only briefly before selecting yet another passage, one Briggs hadn't noticed during their initial exploration. "How many routes do you know through this mountain?" Briggs asked, ducking to follow the dog into a narrow tunnel that angled gradually upward. The passage walls here showed signs of both natural formation and human modification. Smooth curves interrupted by chisel marks where miners had widened. Tight spots. As they progressed, Briggs noticed glittering veins of quartz in the rock, occasionally flecked with what might have been gold or pyrite. The prospector's interest in this mountain suddenly made more sense. After several minutes of climbing, the tunnel opened into a small chamber dominated by a breathtaking crystal formation that seemed to grow from floor to ceiling, a column of translucent mineral that glowed with a faint inner light when Briggs's lantern approached it. "Remarkable," he breathed, reaching out but stopping just short of touching the formation. Such things were created over thousands of years. He felt a responsibility to leave no mark of his passing. Apollo circled the crystal once before continuing to another passage on the far side of the chamber. This one was steeper, requiring Briggs to use natural handholds in the rock as they ascended. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying a faint hint of pine and snow, the outside world. "You've found another way out," Briggs realized, hope quickening. His steps, the passage narrowed further before opening abruptly into a vertical shaft that extended upward beyond the reach of his light. Looking down, Briggs could see they stood on a natural ledge, about 20 feet above the chamber floor. The shaft's walls were textured, with enough protrusions and crevices to make climbing possible, though challenging. Apollo paced the ledge, Clearly frustrated by the obstacle, Briggs examined the shaft more carefully, noting places where ropes might have once been anchored. This had been an access route for the miners, though long since abandoned. "We need climbing gear," Briggs told Apollo, calculating the risks. In his pack, he carried a lightweight emergency rope, perhaps sufficient for this purpose, if anchored properly. As he assessed the situation, a faint crackling sound caught his attention. His emergency radio, silent for hours, was picking up fragments of transmission. The signal was weak and broken, but unmistakably Captain Hayes's voice. Repeat, Briggs, position, search and rescue. Briggs quickly adjusted the radio settings, trying to strengthen the reception. "This is Briggs, receiving poorly. We are sheltered in a cave system approximately 2 miles northwest of Blackridge Peak. Do you copy?" Static hissed, then, "Copy. Storm has window of 6 hours before, second front." The message was clear enough. The initial storm had temporarily abated, creating a brief opportunity before a second wave hit. If they were going to attempt an exit, it needed to be soon. Briggs checked his watch and made quick calculations. Even if they managed to climb the shaft and exit the cave, they'd still face treacherous conditions getting down the mountain. But remaining in the cave meant potentially being trapped for days longer, with limited supplies and no guarantee of rescue. Apollo seemed to sense his dilemma, watching intently as Briggs weighed their options. The dog's confidence throughout their journey gave Briggs a sense of security he couldn't entirely rationalize, but had come to trust. "What do you think, boy? Can we make it?" In response, Apollo moved to a specific spot on the ledge and began pawing at what appeared to be loose rubble. Curious, Briggs joined him, clearing away stones to reveal what lay beneath, a weathered wooden chest, its metal fittings corroded but intact. "What have you found now?" Briggs murmured, carefully opening the lid. Inside lay climbing equipment, ancient by modern standards but preserved in the cave's stable environment. Coiled hemp rope, iron pitons, a primitive harness fashioned from leather. Tools left by the miners for exactly this route. Briggs tested the rope cautiously. Though decades old, the dry cave air had prevented significant deterioration. It might hold for a single careful ascent. As he examined the equipment, his radio crackled again. "Briggs, helicopter. Search grid. Respond with location." Hope surged. If the rescue team could get a helicopter in the air during this lull, and if he could somehow signal them. The shaft above suddenly darkened as a cloud of snow fell through its upper opening. Evidence that it indeed connected to the surface, and that the weather outside remained treacherous despite the storm's temporary easing. Apollo watched him expectantly, poised at the base of the climb. The choice was clear: trust in Apollo's guidance and attempt the ascent, or wait for a rescue that might never reach them. Briggs began methodically testing the old climbing gear, checking anchor points in the rock wall. "All right, boy," he said softly, "show me the way out." The ascent proved more challenging than Briggs had anticipated. The old rope creaked ominously with each pull, and the pitons he hammered into crevices for security felt less than trustworthy. Apollo watched from below, uncharacteristically anxious, whining softly whenever Briggs paused to catch his breath. "Just a little further," Briggs called down, his voice echoing in the vertical shaft. The air grew noticeably colder as he climbed, carrying the unmistakable bite of mountain winter. 20 feet up, then 30. The shaft narrowed in places, widened in others. Evidence of the miners' work appeared intermittently. Old wooden supports, rusted spikes driven into the rock. Briggs marveled at their determination, tunneling through solid mountain with primitive tools, following veins of precious metal deeper into the earth. Finally, his hand reached the top edge of the shaft. Pulling himself up with straining muscles, Briggs emerged into a small cave opening, partially blocked by wind-blown snow. Daylight filtered through the white barrier, casting the space in ethereal blue. He secured the rope and called down to Apollo. "Your turn, boy." The dog needed no further encouragement. With remarkable agility despite his recent injuries, Apollo scrambled up the rope, using the same holds Briggs had found. Years of military training had prepared the Malinois for exactly such challenges. Once Apollo joined him, Briggs turned his attention to the snow barrier. Carefully, he dug away at its edges, creating a passage just wide enough to squeeze through. The opening revealed a world transformed by the storm's first assault. Trees bowed under heavy snow, the landscape smoothed into unrecognizable contours. But as Briggs pulled himself fully outside, scanning their surroundings, recognition dawned with a jolt that left him momentarily breathless. "Eagle Ridge," he whispered. They stood near the summit where, 3 years earlier, he had fallen during a solitary climb the day he lost Catherine's locket. The distinctive twisted pine that had been his landmark still stood, though now laden with ice that transformed it into a crystalline sculpture. Apollo moved to a specific spot several yards away, pacing in a circle before looking expectantly at Briggs. Joining him, Briggs recognized the exact location of his fall, a treacherous section where the trail narrowed alongside a steep drop-off. "This is where it happened," he said, kneeling to examine the ground now hidden beneath snow. "The clasp broke as I was climbing. I searched for hours." He pictured the locket tumbling down, disappearing into a crevice. The same fissure, he now realized, that connected to the cave system below. An impossible journey that somehow brought the precious memento to rest among a long-dead miner's treasures, where Apollo would find it months later. The coincidence defied rational explanation. Or perhaps, as Catherine's journal suggested, it wasn't coincidence at all, but something else. Patterns connecting beneath the surface of observable reality. Briggs retrieved the locket from his pocket, holding it in his gloved palm. The silver caught the wan sunlight, seeming to glow against the white landscape. Apollo sat beside him, watching the locket with the same intensity he'd shown in the cave. "You came all this way," Briggs said softly. "Through a mountain lion attack. Through winter storms. You found something I'd given up for lost." A glint in the snow caught his eye, the metal tip of an old climbing piton, similar to those they'd found in the chest below, but clearly older, its placement suggesting it had been driven into rock that had since weathered away. JTM had climbed. Here too, perhaps a century ago, following the same path Briggs had taken. The realization struck him with unexpected force. How many others had stood in this spot, facing their own mountains, carrying their own precious memories? How many had lost and found, struggled and persevered? The thought was both humbling and strangely comforting. He was part of something larger than his solitary grief. Apollo suddenly stiffened, ears alert. A distant mechanical thrum became audible, the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors echoing between peaks. Briggs quickly unfolded his emergency signal mirror from his pack. The helicopter appeared as a dark speck against the pale sky, following what must be a search grid pattern. Angling the mirror to catch and reflect sunlight, Briggs sent a series of deliberate flashes toward the aircraft. The helicopter altered course almost immediately, banking toward their position. The radio at Briggs's belt crackled to life. This time with perfect clarity. Visual contact established with ground signal. Confirm identity. "This is Ranger Briggs with K9 Apollo," he responded, relief flooding through him. "We're both alive and mobile, on the southeast face of Eagle Ridge." "Copy that, Briggs. Hold position. Extraction in approximately 5 minutes." Apollo pressed against Briggs's leg, his mission seemingly complete. Together they watched the helicopter approach, its rotors sweeping snow into miniature cyclones as it sought a safe hover position. "We're going home, boy," Briggs said, one hand resting on Apollo's head, the other still holding the locket that had led them both to this moment of unexpected rescue. The helicopter couldn't land on the steep, snow-laden slope of Eagle Ridge. Instead, it hovered precariously while a rescue technician was lowered on a cable. The young man's orange search and rescue flag whipped violently in the rotor wash as he touched down beside Briggs and Apollo. "Sergeant Briggs!" he shouted over the deafening noise. "I'm Luis Martinez, Blackridge SAR. Are you injured?" "We're both mobile," Briggs called back, gesturing to Apollo. "The dog has some healing wounds but can travel." Martinez nodded, evaluating the situation with professional efficiency. "Too risky to airlift you both from this position. There's a team coming up from the western approach. We'll rendezvous with them and hike down to the extraction point." He spoke rapidly into his radio, confirming coordinates, then pointed toward a less steep section of the ridge. "We need to move. There's a weather window, but it's closing fast." As the helicopter pulled away, the sudden silence felt almost physical. Martinez checked his GPS, then led them along the ridgeline, his movement sure despite the treacherous footing. Apollo followed closely behind Briggs, occasionally stopping to check their back trail, as if ensuring they weren't being followed, or, perhaps, Briggs thought, making sure they could find their way back if needed. "Captain Hayes has been coordinating search efforts for 36 hours straight," Martinez said as they hiked. "Wouldn't rest even when the first storm hit. Said you two were too stubborn to die in a little blizzard." Briggs smiled despite his exhaustion. "Sounds like Hayes. The entire rescue team volunteered," Martinez continued. "Darren Miller insisted on joining the ground crew, even though he's not certified for winter rescue. And Dr. Chen has been on standby at base camp." The news surprised Briggs. After 5 years of deliberate isolation, he'd convinced himself that only Apollo truly cared whether he lived or died. The thought that others had risked themselves for his sake stirred something long dormant within him. They crested a small rise and spotted the ground team approaching, 4 figures in bright rescue gear, navigating the snowy slope. Briggs recognized Darren's lanky form immediately, even bundled in winter clothing. The young technician broke into a jog when he saw them, his relief evident even at a distance. "You crazy old man," he called out, the insult clearly affectionate. "Hayes said you'd probably be drinking tea in some cave while we froze our asses off looking for you." "Not far from the truth," Briggs admitted, as they converged. A woman stepped forward, Dr. Chen, her medical kit already in hand. "Let me see him," she said, kneeling beside Apollo without waiting for permission. Her experienced hands moved quickly over the dog, checking the wounds she'd treated days earlier. "His stitches have held," she announced, her professional demeanor softening as Apollo licked her gloved hand. "Whatever adventure you two had, he handled it well." He led the way, Briggs said simply. The team leader, a weathered man Briggs recognized from previous rescue operations, consulted his satellite device. "We need to move now. Base camp is 3 miles down, and the next front is advancing faster than predicted." The descent was arduous despite the team's support. The storm had transformed familiar trails into treacherous obstacles, requiring careful navigation around hidden drop-offs and unstable snow bridges. Twice they had to rope together to cross particularly dangerous sections. Throughout the journey, Apollo stayed unusually close to Briggs, as if his self-appointed mission remained incomplete. Occasionally, the dog would look up at the mountain. Behind them, his attention fixed momentarily on Eagle Ridge before returning to the task of descent. Radio updates from base camp grew increasingly urgent as they hiked. The second storm front was accelerating, threatening to close their window of opportunity. Even through his exhaustion, Briggs could sense the changing air pressure that heralded significant weather. "There!" Martinez finally called out, pointing to a clearing ahead where portable emergency shelters had been erected. The bright orange tents stood out starkly against the white landscape, a beacon of safety. As they approached, a familiar figure emerged from the command tent. Captain Hayes, her lined face showing the strain of sleepless vigil, but breaking into undisguised relief at the sight of them. "Cutting it close as usual, Briggs," she called out, her gruff tone belied by the emotion in her eyes. "Had some exploring to do," he responded, feeling a smile tug at his mouth despite his exhaustion. Hayes knelt to greet Apollo, her usual formality forgotten as she checked him over with careful hands. "Good work, soldier," she told the dog quietly. Bringing him home was above and beyond. The rest of the team moved quickly, breaking down equipment and loading it into waiting vehicles. The extraction point had been established at the lowest safe elevation, where the ground was stable enough for helicopter landing if needed, but accessible by specialized all-terrain vehicles in emergency conditions. Dr. Chen approached Briggs. Again, this time focusing on him rather than Apollo. "You both need proper medical evaluation," she said firmly. "Whatever you found up there, it will wait until you're recovered." Briggs nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past days. The cave, the miner's remains, the crystal chamber, the dreams of Catherine. They seemed almost unreal now against the practical urgency of evacuation. Only Apollo's steady presence at his side reassured him that it had all been real. The dog carried the memory of their journey in his watchful eyes, in the way he stayed oriented toward the mountain even as they prepared to leave it behind. "Let's go home, boy," Briggs said softly as they were guided toward the waiting transport. "We have a lot to think about." News of Apollo's remarkable journey spread quickly through the small mountain community. By the time Briggs was cleared to return to his cabin 3 days later, the story had taken on near-mythic proportions. The wounded K9, who disappeared for 3 months, only to return with a precious memento thought lost forever. Briggs found himself unexpectedly at the center of attention. Local reporters arrived at the ranger station, cameras and recorders in hand. Wildlife experts called, eager to study Apollo's unprecedented behavior. Even university researchers reached out, interested in the cave system and its historical artifacts. "You've become a celebrity," Captain Hayes remarked dryly as she drove Briggs and Apollo back to the ranger station. "Could start charging for interviews." "I'd rather be left alone," Briggs muttered, though with less conviction than he might have. "Expressed before the journey. That ship has sailed," Hayes replied. "The district supervisor is talking about a formal commendation for Apollo, some civilian Medal of Valor nonsense. He deserves recognition," Briggs found himself saying. "What he did was extraordinary." Hayes glanced at him, surprise evident in her expression. "You've changed," she observed. The old Briggs would have hidden in his cabin until everyone forgot about it. Perhaps she was right. Something had shifted during those days in the mountain's heart, not just his understanding of Apollo's journey, but something deeper within himself. At the ranger station, a small crowd had gathered, not just officials and reporters, but locals, who had followed the search and rescue operation with concern. Dr. Chen was there, as was Darren and other park staff. To Briggs's surprise, he spotted Thomas Whitefeather, an elder from the Shoshone tribe, whose ancestral lands included these mountains. As Briggs and Apollo emerged from the vehicle, a spontaneous round of applause broke out. Apollo, typically aloof with strangers, carried himself with quiet dignity, accepting the attention as if he understood its meaning. The district supervisor stepped forward, a small wooden box in her hands. "On behalf of the Department of Interior and the Park Service, we'd like to present this Medal of Valor to K9 Apollo for extraordinary service beyond the call of duty." The simple ceremony was brief, for which Briggs was grateful. Apollo stood perfectly still as the medal was attached to his collar, his eyes never leaving Briggs's face. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed into smaller conversations, Thomas Whitefeather approached them. The elder's weathered face was solemn. As he studied Apollo, "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the dog. Briggs nodded, and Whitefeather knelt slowly, his arthritic knees protesting audibly. Apollo allowed the elder to place a hand on his head, closing his eyes briefly at the contact. "Our stories speak of guide spirits," Whitefeather said quietly. "Beings who move between worlds to help those who have lost their way." He looked up at Briggs. You found more than a lost keepsake in those mountains. Briggs hesitated, then nodded. The cave system. There were pictographs, ancient ones. The place of voices, Whitefeather confirmed, sacred to my people for many generations. A place where the boundary between worlds grows thin. The elder reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something small that he pressed into Briggs's palm. A carved stone pendant depicting a wolf or large dog worn smooth by time and handling. This was found at that site by my grandfathers. Grandfather, he explained, it belongs with one who has walked the path your companion has walked. Before Briggs could respond, Dr. Chen approached, her clinical demeanor tempered by genuine warmth. Apollo's final checkup shows remarkable healing, she reported. Whatever happened up there, it seems to have accelerated his recovery. The mountain provides, Whitefeather said simply. As the conversations continued around them, Briggs found himself watching Apollo with new eyes. The dog sat alertly at his side, occasionally acknowledging greetings, but maintaining his characteristic reserve. Yet there was something different about him now, a sense of completion, of purpose fulfilled. Later, as the gathering began to disperse, Captain Hayes pulled Briggs aside, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. The retirement paperwork is still on my desk, she said. But I have another proposal to consider. She handed him a folder stamped with official logos. Regional Canine Training Program. They need someone with your experience. Briggs accepted the folder without opening it, surprised by his own interest. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. Hayes glanced at Apollo, who was receiving a final examination from Dr. Chen. He's not the only one who deserves a second act, Mike. As twilight settled over the station, Briggs found a moment of solitude on the porch, Apollo at his side. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks golden in the setting sun. The storm had passed, leaving the world renewed beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Catherine's locket hung around his neck now, its familiar weight a comfort rather than a burden. Apollo leaned against his leg, a warm presence in the gathering chill. "Thank you," Briggs said softly. The words meant for both the dog beside him and the memory he carried within. Spring came to the mountains with gentle persistence, melting. The snow in stages, revealing the earth beneath in patches of vibrant green. Briggs spent the warming days clearing a small area near the ranger station, a natural overlook with views of both the station and Eagle Ridge in the distance. Apollo supervised the work with dignified interest, his coat gleaming with health in the spring sunshine. The dog's celebrity status had faded somewhat over the winter months, but visitors to the station still asked about him, still requested photos with the hero K9 who had made headlines. On a clear morning in early May, a small group gathered at the newly created site. Captain Hayes stood with military straightness despite her civilian attire. Dr. Chen had closed her clinic for the morning to attend. Darren helped with final adjustments to the simple stone bench Briggs had installed. Thomas Whitefeather had come, bringing several members of the tribal council. At the center of the clearing stood a bronze plaque mounted on a natural boulder. Briggs had agonized over the wording for weeks before settling on simple truth, in honor of Catherine Briggs, whose love transcends boundaries, and Apollo, who followed an impossible trail to bring healing. Some journeys continue beyond what eyes can see. The small ceremony was brief and without ostentation, as Catherine would have preferred. Whitefeather offered a traditional blessing, speaking in his native language before translating. We acknowledge this as a place of connection, between earth and sky, between what is seen and unseen, between those who walk with us and those who have walked ahead. May those who rest here find peace in knowing they are remembered. Briggs stepped forward, placing Catherine's photo album at the base of the memorial. He'd had a waterproof case created to protect it, allowing visitors to open and view the images. Inside, Catherine laughing on their wedding day, Catherine with Apollo as a young dog, Catherine in the garden she'd loved. Catherine believed in connections that continued beyond what we could explain, Briggs said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. She wouldn't be surprised by anything that happened on that mountain. Apollo moved to his side, pressing against his leg in that familiar way that had become a comfort over the years. The dog had fully recovered from his ordeal, though he carried a few new scars that added character to his dignified bearing. After the ceremony, as people lingered to talk, Dr. Chen approached Briggs with unexpected hesitation. "I've been thinking about Apollo's abilities," she said carefully. "There's growing research on service dogs for veterans with PTSD, their capacity for emotional connection, for providing exactly what's needed at critical moments." She glanced at Apollo. "Not every dog has these qualities, but those who do can change lives." "What are you suggesting?" Briggs asked. "A partnership. I provide the medical oversight, you provide the training expertise. We could work with the VA to match dogs with veterans who need them most." The idea resonated in a way Briggs hadn't expected. He thought of his own healing journey, how Apollo had been instrumental in guiding him through his darkest times. "I'd need to think about it," he said, though he already felt a spark of interest. Dr. Chen nodded. "Of course. But Apollo has demonstrated something extraordinary, a kind of emotional intelligence beyond typical canine capabilities. It would be a shame not to share that gift with others who are struggling." Later, as the gathering dispersed, Captain Hayes lingered behind. She stood beside Briggs at the memorial, both of them looking toward Eagle Ridge in comfortable silence. "You still haven't given me an answer about the K9 training program," she said finally. "I've been considering options," Briggs admitted. "Chen has an interesting proposal too." Hayes nodded, unsurprised. "You're not the same man who came to this station 5 years ago hiding from the world." "No," Briggs agreed. "I'm not." They watched as Apollo explored the perimeter of the memorial site, moving with purpose, occasionally stopping to raise his head as if catching a scent on the breeze. "Whatever you decide, make sure it honors what happened up there," Hayes said, gesturing toward the distant peaks. "Some experiences aren't meant to be filed away and forgotten." As twilight approached, the visitors departed, leaving Briggs and Apollo alone at the memorial. The setting sun cast long shadows across the clearing, bathing the bronze plaque in golden light. Briggs sat on the stone bench, watching as Apollo settled at his feet with a contented sigh. For the first time in years, the weight of grief had lifted, replaced by something he'd never expected to feel again, possibility. "What do you think, boy?" he asked softly. "Ready for a new mission?" Apollo raised his head, his intelligent eyes meeting Briggs's with what could only be described as understanding. Whatever path lay ahead, they would walk it together, guided by connections that transcended ordinary explanation. 6 months later, the training field behind the ranger station had been transformed. What was once an unused meadow now featured obstacles, scent trails, and training equipment. 4 handlers worked with their dogs, following Briggs's quiet but firm instructions. "Remember, you're not teaching them to track," Briggs explained to a young veteran with a German Shepherd puppy. "You're helping them understand what they already know instinctively. The bond between you is what matters most." Apollo moved among the trainees with the dignity of a senior instructor, occasionally demonstrating a technique with flawless precision or gently correcting a younger dog with a subtle body movement. At 7 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of an animal who knew his purpose. The program had exceeded everyone's expectations. Combining Captain Hayes's administrative support, Dr. Chen's medical expertise, and Briggs's training experience, they had created something unique. A service dog program specifically designed for wilderness therapy. Veterans spent 6 weeks in the mountains, working with dogs specially selected for their emotional intelligence and tracking abilities. "Time for the final exercise," Briggs announced, lifting a silver training whistle that had become his trademark. "Tool." Unlike traditional whistles, this one produced a tone almost too soft to hear, teaching handlers to pay attention, to watch for subtle cues rather than obvious signals. The group moved toward the trail leading into the foothills. Today marked the culmination of their training, a complex tracking and rescue scenario designed to test both dogs and handlers under realistic conditions. "Sergeant Briggs," a voice called from the ranger station. Darren jogged toward them, waving a folder. "That military contact you've been waiting to hear from, Colonel Richards? He just emailed. They want to implement your program at 3 more locations." Briggs nodded, surprised by the surge of satisfaction he felt. What had begun as personal healing had expanded into something with potential to help dozens, perhaps hundreds of veterans and their service dogs. "We'll review it after the exercise," he told Darren, who had become an enthusiastic assistant instructor despite his initial claim to not be a dog person. As the group prepared for their final test, Briggs caught sight of a familiar figure at the edge of the field, Thomas Whitefeather, observing quietly. The elder had become a regular visitor, occasionally sharing traditional stories about the spiritual connection between humans and animals that complemented Briggs's practical training methods. Apollo noticed Whitefeather too, breaking protocol to trot over and greet him with unusual familiarity. Briggs watched as the elder knelt stiffly, speaking words too soft to hear. Whatever he said made Apollo's ears perk forward with interest. "Everything okay?" Briggs asked when Whitefeather joined the group. "More than okay," the elder replied, with a slight smile. "Your work honors the old connections. It's good to see healing flow in many directions." The training exercise proceeded flawlessly. Each handler dog team demonstrated their new skills, working together with a synchronicity that hadn't existed 6 weeks earlier. Briggs felt a quiet pride watching them, especially the veterans whose haunted expressions had gradually softened. During their time in the mountains, as the sun began to set, the group returned to the station for a simple graduation ceremony. Dr. Chen presented each handler with certification documents, while Captain Hayes, recently promoted to regional director, offered official congratulations. "What you've learned here goes beyond commands and techniques," Briggs told them in his brief closing remarks. "You've rediscovered something essential, the capacity to connect, to trust, to move forward together. Take that with you, wherever you go next." Later, in the quiet of his cabin, no longer a place of isolation but a warm home filled with photographs and mementos, Briggs sat on the porch with Apollo beside him. The dog's head rested on his knee, a familiar weight that anchored him to the present while allowing his thoughts to wander. Catherine's journal lay open on his lap, turned to an entry he'd read countless times. "The most profound healing doesn't erase our wounds, but transforms them into bridges, connecting us to others who suffer, allowing us to guide them because we've walked the difficult path ourselves." Apollo stirred, lifting his head to gaze toward the mountain peaks, now bathed in alpenglow. For a moment, Briggs could almost imagine Catherine sitting with them, her hand gentle on Apollo's fur, her eyes bright with approval for the life they'd built from the fragments of loss. The locket around his neck caught the fading light, a small gleam against his shirt. He no longer needed to open it to remember her face. Memory had become not a burden, but a foundation, supporting rather than weighing him down. Dawn would bring a new group of veterans, new dogs eager to learn, new possibilities for connection and healing. For now, Briggs was content to sit in the gathering darkness with Apollo, watching the stars appear one by one above the mountains that had taken so much from him, and then, against all odds, given back something precious he hadn't known he needed to find.